Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his ship and looked out at the stars. The UES Liberty was not the biggest ship in the galaxy, but it was his home. For 15 years he had traveled between human colonies, carrying supplies and messages. His crew was small, but they were good people. Lisa Parker knew every star map by heart. Ron Baker could fix any engine problem with spare parts and hope. Amy Collins could talk to anyone in the galaxy and make them understand what humans needed. The Liberty was heading to New Boston Colony when the message came. Amy's face went white as she listened to her radio. She turned to Morrison with fear in her eyes. The colony was under attack by something they had never seen before. The message was breaking up, but they could hear screams and explosions. Then the signal went dead. Morrison had heard stories about the Devourers, but no one believed they were real. They were supposed to be monsters from beyond the galaxy that ate entire worlds. The big alien races like the Vorthak and the Zephyrians said they were just old stories meant to scare children. But now Morrison was starting to think the stories might be true. For 300 years, humans had been part of the galactic community. They were not the strongest race or the smartest. The Vorthak had huge armies and loved to fight. The Zephyrians had technology that seemed like magic. The Keepers were ancient beings who knew secrets from when the galaxy was young. Humans just got along with everyone and helped when they could. The Galactic Council met on a space station bigger than Earth's moon. Representatives from all the major races would gather to make decisions that affected billions of beings. Humans had a seat at the table, but it was a small one. When the big races talked about important things, humans mostly just listened and tried to help where they could. Morrison remembered the last council meeting he had attended. The Vorthak general had been talking about expanding their territory. The Zephyrian ambassador wanted to build new research stations. The Keeper elder spoke in riddles about ancient threats returning. When the human representative suggested they should work together more, everyone nodded politely, but nothing changed. That was how things had always been. Humans ran 12 small colonies and traded with anyone who would deal with them. They were good at fixing problems between other races because they did not take sides. When the Vorthak and Zephyrians had their border war, human diplomats helped them make peace. When the Keepers needed someone to carry messages to distant worlds, human ships did the job. But now something was coming that might change everything. Morrison ordered his crew to set course for New Boston at maximum speed. The Liberty's engines were old, but Baker pushed them as hard as he could. Parker plotted the fastest route through hyperspace. Collins tried to contact other human colonies to warn them. The news was not good. 3 more colonies had gone silent in the past day. The attacks always followed the same pattern. Strange ships would appear in the outer system and move toward the inhabited worlds. The colonies would send distress signals describing monsters that looked like machines and animals mixed together. Then the signals would stop. Morrison knew that the human fleet was small. They had maybe 50 ships that could fight, and most of them were converted cargo haulers like the Liberty. The major races had thousands of warships each. If these Devourers were as dangerous as they seemed, humans would need help to survive. But when Morrison tried to contact the Galactic Council, he got a surprise. The major races were not preparing to help anyone. They were pulling their fleets back to protect their homeworlds. The Vorthak general said the outer colonies were not worth defending. The Zephyrian admiral claimed they needed time to study the threat. The Keeper elder spoke about cycles of destruction and renewal that humans did not understand. Amy Collins finally got through to Earth Command. Admiral Susan Grant's voice was steady, but Morrison could hear the worry underneath. Earth's defenses were being strengthened, but there were not enough ships to protect all the human colonies. Some would have to be abandoned if the attacks continued. Morrison felt anger building in his chest. The big races talked about honor and wisdom and ancient knowledge, but when real danger came, they ran away. They were willing to let the smaller species die to buy themselves time. It was not right, but there was nothing humans could do about it. The Liberty dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the New Boston system. What they saw made Morrison's blood run cold. The colony world was dark. No lights, no radio signals, no signs of life. Huge biomechanical ships hung in orbit like vultures. They were unlike anything in the galactic databases. They looked grown rather than built, with organic curves and mechanical parts fused together. Parker scanned the system with every sensor they had. The ships were massive, each one bigger than a human space station. They seemed to be stripping materials from the planet's surface and feeding them into their hulls. Whatever these devourers were, they were not just destroyers, they were harvesters. Collins managed to pick up a weak signal from the planet's surface. Someone was still alive down there, hiding in the ruins of New Boston City. The voice was scared and whispering, but it was human. They were trapped in the basement of the Colonial Administration building with maybe 20 other survivors. Morrison made a decision that would change everything. Instead of running back to Earth like a smart captain would do, he ordered his crew to prepare for a rescue mission. Baker started modifying their shuttle for stealth operations. Parker plotted an approach that would keep them hidden from the devourer ships. Collins prepared emergency supplies and medical equipment. As the Liberty moved carefully toward New Boston, Morrison thought about what Admiral Grant had told him during their last conversation. She said that sometimes being small and weak was an advantage because nobody expected you to do anything important. Maybe it was time for humans to stop being what everyone expected them to be. The rescue mission was about to begin, and Morrison had no idea that what they found on New Boston would give humanity the key to saving the entire galaxy. Sometimes, the most important discoveries come from the most desperate situations, and this was about to be one of those times. Dr. Helen Carter had spent her entire career studying alien biology. Her laboratory on Earth's orbital research station was filled with specimens from across the galaxy. She knew how Vorthak warriors could survive in any environment and why Zephyrian energy beings could manipulate matter with their thoughts. But the data coming from the Devourer attacks was unlike anything she had ever seen. The morning after New Boston went dark, Carter received emergency data packets from the doomed colony. The automated systems had kept recording right until the day, and sending everything to Earth through quantum relay stations. What Carter saw in those files made her stomach turn. The Devourers were not just destroying things randomly, they were learning. Each attack wave was different from the last. When the colonists used energy weapons, the creatures adapted thicker armor. When they tried to hide in bunkers, the monsters developed new ways to dig them out. The Devourers were studying human tactics and finding counters for everything the colonists tried. But Carter noticed something else in the data. The creatures seemed confused by some of the human responses. When colonists used improvised weapons or changed tactics quickly, the Devourers hesitated. They took longer to adapt to unexpected strategies than they did to standard military procedures. Carter called her assistant Danny Walsh into the lab. Walsh had been a military analyst before becoming a scientist, and he understood both warfare and xenobiology. Together they started comparing the Devourer attacks to historical records of galactic conflicts. What they found was disturbing. Every major race in the galaxy fought the same way they had for thousands of years. The Vorthak used overwhelming force and direct assault. The Zephyrians relied on energy manipulation and technological superiority. The Keepers deployed ancient weapons and defensive systems that had not changed since before humans learned to use fire. The patterns were so predictable that Carter could have written a manual for fighting each race. Apparently, the Devourers had done exactly that. The creatures had encountered similar species in other galaxies and developed specific counters for each type of warfare. They knew exactly how to beat every galactic power because they had beaten identical enemies before. But humans were different. Carter pulled up files on human military history and found something remarkable. Humans had never developed a single way of fighting. They used whatever worked and changed strategies constantly. From ancient warriors who threw rocks to modern Space Marines who improvised weapons from spare parts, humans adapted to every situation. Carter sent her preliminary findings to Admiral Grant on Earth. The response came back within hours. Grant was ordering Captain Morrison to investigate the New Boston attack site and gather more information. But Carter suspected Morrison would find more than just data. If her theories were correct, there might be survivors who had figured out how to fight back. Meanwhile, Morrison and his crew were approaching New Boston in their modified shuttle. Ron Baker had installed every stealth system he could think of, and a few he invented on the spot. The shuttle looked more like a debris field than a spacecraft, but it was invisible to the Devourer sensors. Lisa Parker guided them through the wreckage, orbiting the planet. Destroyed ships and space stations created a maze of twisted metal and frozen atmosphere. The Devourer vessels moved slowly through the debris, harvesting useful materials and ignoring everything else. Parker found a path that kept them hidden behind the larger pieces of wreckage. When they reached the planet's surface, Morrison saw destruction beyond anything he had imagined. New Boston had been a beautiful city, with parks and towers reaching toward the sky. Now it looked like someone had taken a giant blender to everything. Buildings were partially dissolved, streets were cracked open, and strange organic growths covered the ruins. But Amy Collins was still picking up that weak radio signal. Someone was alive in the basement of the Colonial Administration building. Morrison decided to risk a landing even though Devourer patrol units were moving through the streets above. The basement was dark and filled with scared people. 23 colonists had survived by hiding in the deepest part of the building. Their leader was Carl Johnson, a former military instructor who had been teaching colonial defense classes. Johnson looked like he had not slept in days, but his eyes were alert and angry. Johnson told Morrison a story that changed everything. The Devourers had arrived exactly as the reports described. Huge biomechanical ships had dropped swarms of creatures that looked like a nightmare fusion of machine and beast. The Colonial Defense Force had fought bravely, but their standard tactics were useless. But then something unexpected happened. A group of civilians led by Johnson started fighting back using methods that had nothing to do with military doctrine. They used homemade explosives, improvised traps, and psychological warfare that confused the creatures. Instead of fighting the Devourers directly, they made the monsters chase them into ambushes and dangerous areas. Johnson showed Morrison a collection of destroyed Devourer scouts. Each one had been killed in a different way. Some were blown up, with mining charges. Others had been crushed by carefully triggered building collapses. A few had been lured into the city's industrial area and dissolved by chemical spills. The most interesting thing was how the creatures had reacted. Instead of adapting quickly like they had to standard military tactics, the Devourers seemed confused by the unconventional attacks. They would hesitate before responding and sometimes make mistakes that got them killed. Johnson explained that he had learned this approach from studying human military history. Guerrilla warfare, irregular tactics, and fighting dirty were human specialties that other galactic races considered dishonorable or ineffective. But against the Devourers, these methods worked better than anything else. Morrison realized that Dr. Carter had been right. Humans had something unique that the other races lacked. They could adapt and improvise in ways that confused enemies who expected predictable responses. The Devourers were designed to counter logical military thinking, but human warfare was often anything but logical. Collins managed to establish a secure communication link with Earth. Morrison reported what they had found while Johnson shared his tactical discoveries with military analysts. The response was immediate and dramatic. Admiral Grant authorized the formation of experimental combat units based on Johnson's methods. Back on Earth, Carter was working with military planners to develop new strategies. The key was unpredictability. Instead of following established doctrine, human forces would need to constantly change their approach. They would use whatever weapons they could find, fight from unexpected positions, and generally behave in ways that made no sense to rational observers. The first test would come sooner than anyone expected. Devourer scouts had been detected moving toward the human colony of New Haven. The colony had a small defense force, but they were trained in conventional tactics that would be useless against the creatures. Morrison and Johnson would have to get there first and teach the defenders how to fight like humans instead of like proper soldiers. As the Liberty prepared to leave New Boston with its cargo of survivors, Morrison felt something he had not experienced before. For the first time since joining the galactic community, humans had found something they were uniquely good at. They were not the strongest or the smartest race, but they might be the most adaptable. The galaxy was about to learn that sometimes The best way to win a fight was not to follow the rules but to make up new ones as you went along. Humanity was preparing to teach the universe a lesson about the power of creative chaos, and it was going to be a lesson that nobody would ever forget. Colonel Mary Brooks had been considered a troublemaker by her superiors for most of her military career. While other officers followed standard procedures and established doctrine, Brooks asked uncomfortable questions like why humans were trying to fight like aliens when they had their own perfectly good ways of making war. Her unconventional ideas had kept her from getting promoted, but now those same ideas made her the most important person in the human military. Admiral Grant called Brooks to Earth Command the day after Morrison's report from New Boston. The rescue mission had proven that human irregular tactics could work against the Devourers, but now they needed to figure out how to use this advantage on a larger scale. Brooks was given unlimited resources and told to develop a completely new way of fighting. Brooks started by studying every human military conflict in recorded history. She looked at ancient battles where outnumbered forces had defeated larger armies through clever tactics. She examined guerrilla campaigns where irregular fighters had worn down professional militaries. She analyzed special operations missions, where small teams had accomplished impossible objectives through audacity and improvisation. What Brooks found was that humans had always been at their best when they ignored the rules and made up their own. From the Trojan horse to modern asymmetric warfare, human military genius came from thinking differently than their enemies expected. The problem was that 3 centuries of galactic civilization had made humans try to fight like everyone else. Working with engineer Pete Martinez, Brooks began developing new combat doctrines that emphasized human strengths. Martinez had designed most of the defensive systems on human colonies, and he understood how to turn civilian infrastructure into military assets. Together they created training programs that taught soldiers to think like criminals, inventors, and madmen instead of proper military personnel. The first test of their new methods came when Devourer scouts approached New Haven Colony. Commander Alex Hughes was given command of the defense force and told to forget everything he knew about space combat. Instead of meeting the enemy in traditional ship formations, Hughes was ordered to use every dirty trick that Brooks and Martinez could think of. Hughes took a mixed force of military vessels and civilian ships toward the edge of the New Haven system. His pilots included Sarah Young, an ace fighter pilot who had been court-martialed twice for refusing to follow tactical doctrine, and Mike Turner, a cargo hauler captain who knew every smuggling trick in the book. The rest of the force was made up of miners, traders, and colonists who had volunteered to defend their home. The Devourer fleet arrived exactly as predicted. 3 massive bioships entered the system and began scanning for targets. Their escort vessels spread out in a standard search pattern that would have been effective against any normal military force. But Hughes was not planning to fight a normal battle. Sarah Young led the first attack wave in modified civilian shuttles that had been loaded with mining explosives. Instead of engaging the Devourer escorts in dogfights, she flew her squadron directly at the enemy capital ships and released her cargo. The explosions looked random and ineffective, but they served a different purpose. They were a distraction. While the Devourers were trying to understand why humans were essentially committing suicide with cargo shuttles, Mike Turner brought his freighter alongside one of the bioships. His cargo hold was filled with industrial waste, construction debris, and garbage from the colony. He opened his bay doors and dumped everything directly onto the enemy vessel's hull. The Devourers had no idea how to respond to being attacked with trash. Their tactical computers had no protocols for dealing with enemies who threw garbage at them. While they were trying to clean the debris off their sensors, Hughes brought the rest of his force in for the real attack. But even the main assault was unlike anything in galactic military history. Instead of coordinated strikes with energy weapons, the human ships attacked with whatever they had available. Mining lasers designed for cutting asteroids sliced through bioship hulls. Cargo containers filled with industrial chemicals were fired like missiles. Even the colony's waste processing ship joined the fight by spraying sewage at enemy sensors. The Devourers tried to adapt, but their programming could not keep up with the chaos. Every time they developed a counter for one type of attack, the humans switched to something completely different. When the creatures hardened their hulls against mining lasers, the humans started using construction equipment as battering rams. When the bioships deployed jamming fields, human pilots started navigating by looking out the windows and shouting directions to each other over comm systems. The battle lasted 6 hours and ended when Sarah Young managed to crash her damaged fighter directly into a bioship's command center. The massive vessel began spinning out of control and collided with one of its escorts. The remaining Devourer ships retreated in what appeared to be complete confusion. News of the victory spread across human space faster than official military communications. Colonists who had been preparing to evacuate started organizing their own defense forces. Civilian pilots volunteered to join the military if they could fight using unconventional tactics. For the first time since the invasion began, humans felt like they had a chance. But the real surprise came from outside human territory. The Galactic Council had been monitoring the battle and the results had shocked every major race. Vorthak, General Krex contacted Admiral Grant personally to ask how humans had defeated enemies that had destroyed his best battle fleets. Zephyrian Admiral Veltar wanted to study human tactical data to understand their success. Even the mysterious Keepers sent a representative to Earth. The ancient being spoke in its usual riddles, but the message was clear. The galaxy's oldest race was impressed by humanity's achievement. They had been fighting the Devourers for millennia in other regions of space, and had never seen anything like the human victory at New Haven. Admiral Grant found herself in a position no human had ever experienced. The major galactic powers were asking Earth for help. For 3 centuries, humans had been the junior partners in galactic civilization. Now the senior races wanted to learn from them. But Grant also realized that human tactics could not simply be copied by other species. When Vorthak officers tried to use improvised weapons and irregular strategies, they looked ridiculous. Their culture was built around honor, discipline, and overwhelming force. Asking them to fight with garbage and mining equipment was like asking a tiger to act like a monkey. The Zephyrians had similar problems. Their energy-based warfare and technological superiority made them think in terms of elegant solutions and efficient tactics. Human chaos and improvisation went against everything they believed about how conflicts should be resolved. They could understand human methods intellectually, but could not use them effectively. Brooks realized that humanity's greatest strength was not just their tactical flexibility, but their willingness to look foolish if it meant winning. Other races were too proud or too set in their ways to adopt truly unconventional methods. They wanted to fight with dignity and honor even if it meant losing. As reports came in of more Devourer fleets approaching the galaxy, Grant made a decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to teach alien warriors how to fight like humans, she would offer human advisors to command mixed fleets. If the major races wanted to benefit from human tactical genius, they would have to accept human leadership in combat situations. The response was immediate and unprecedented. For the first time in galactic history, alien commanders were volunteering to serve under human officers. The species that had once considered humanity insignificant were now begging for human military guidance. Colonel Brooks found herself promoted to general and given command of the 1st Joint Species Battle Group. Her orders were simple but revolutionary. She was to take ships from every major galactic power and teach them how to fight like humans. The survival of galactic civilization now depended on convincing proud alien warriors that sometimes the best way to win was to act completely insane. General Kate Nelson stood on the bridge of the UES Constitution and looked out at the strangest fleet ever assembled in galactic history. Vorthak battleships bristled with weapons designed for head-on assault. Zephyrian cruisers hummed with energy, fields that could reshape matter itself. Keeper vessels that looked more like floating temples than warships drifted silently in formation. And scattered throughout the alien armada were human ships that looked like converted cargo haulers and mining rigs. Nelson had been promoted 3 times in the past month as the galactic situation deteriorated. The Devourers were no longer just attacking outer colonies. Their main fleet was moving toward the core systems where billions of beings lived on heavily populated worlds. The major races had tried everything in their military arsenals and nothing worked. Now they were depending on human leadership to save them all. The transformation had not been easy. Commander Steve Phillips was working with Keeper Captain Thelmar to develop combined tactics that mixed ancient technology with human improvisation. The process was frustrating for both sides. Thelmar kept trying to use weapon systems that followed precise mathematical formulas, while Phillips wanted to modify everything with spare parts and creative engineering. Major Julie Green was having similar problems with the Vorthak shock troops. These warriors had been bred for thousands of generations to charge directly at their enemies and fight with honor. Green was trying to teach them hit-and-run tactics, ambush strategies, and the fine art of fighting dirty. The Vorthak understood the concepts intellectually, but their cultural programming made it almost impossible for them to act cowardly, even if it meant winning. The Zephyrians presented different challenges. Their energy beings could manipulate matter with their thoughts, but they thought in terms of elegant equations and efficient solutions. Human chaos offended their sense of mathematical beauty. Admiral Veltar could make his ships dance through space like living art, but he struggled to understand why humans would deliberately create confusion and disorder in their battle plans. Despite the difficulties, the combined fleet was starting to work together. The key breakthrough came when Dr. Helen Carter made another discovery about the Devourers. The creatures were not just adapting to individual tactics, they were learning to counter entire species at once. Every Vorthak ship fought basically the same way, so the Devourers could develop universal counters for all of them. The same was true for Zephyrians and Keepers. But human ships each fought differently because human commanders each thought differently. Sarah Young flew her fighter like a maniac who had never read a tactics manual. Mike Turner used his freighter like a battering ram with delusions of grandeur. Captain Morrison commanded his vessel like a diplomat who had accidentally wandered into a war zone. The Devourers could not develop universal counters for humans because there was no universal human way of fighting. Carter realized that the mixed fleets would need to operate the same way. Instead of having each species contribute their standard capabilities, every ship would need to develop its own unique fighting style. This meant taking Vorthak warriors out of their comfort zone, forcing Zephyrians to think illogically, and convincing Keepers that ancient wisdom sometimes meant doing something completely stupid. The first major test came when a Devourer fleet attacked the Centauri system. This was not another border skirmish or colonial raid. Centauri was home to 12 billion Zephyrians and served as one of their primary research centers. If it fell, the entire Zephyrian collective might collapse. General Nelson took her mixed fleet into the system expecting the hardest battle of her career. The Devourer force was massive, with dozens of bioships supported by thousands of smaller attack craft. Intelligence reports suggested that these creatures had adapted specifically to counter Zephyrian energy-based warfare. They had learned to absorb directed energy attacks and use the power to strengthen their own weapons. The battle began exactly as the Devourers expected. Zephyrian cruisers opened fire with their most powerful energy weapons. The bioships absorbed the attacks and began returning fire with enhanced versions of the same energy types. It looked like the Zephyrians were about to be destroyed by their own technology turned against them. Then Nelson gave the order that changed everything. Instead of continuing the energy duel, every ship in the fleet switched to completely different tactics. Vorthak battleships that normally relied on massive guns started ramming enemy vessels like ancient sailing ships. Zephyrian cruisers began using their matter manipulation abilities to turn space debris into projectile weapons. Keeper vessels activated weapon systems that had not been used for centuries and probably should not have worked at all. The human ships provided the chaos that held everything together. Morrison used the Liberty as a command vessel, coordination platform, and occasional battering ram as the situation required. Sarah Young led fighter squadrons that included Vorthak warriors flying like suicidal maniacs and Zephyrian energy beings, trying to think like humans. The results were messy, illogical, and completely effective. The Devourers had never encountered anything like this mixed species insanity. Their tactical computers had been programmed to counter specific types of warfare, but now they were facing Vorthak ships that fought like humans, Zephyrian vessels that ignored mathematical precision, and human craft that seemed to be making up their tactics as they went along. But the real breakthrough came when Commander Phillips and Captain Thelmar successfully combined Keeper technology with human engineering principles. They created hybrid weapon systems that used ancient energy manipulation techniques powered by jury-rigged human fusion reactors. The result was weapons that worked perfectly despite violating every known principle of physics and engineering. The battle lasted 18 hours and ended when the Devourer command ship was destroyed by a coordinated attack that involved ramming it with a Vorthak battleship, while a Zephyrian cruiser manipulated the resulting explosion, and a Keeper vessel fired some kind of temporal weapon that may have erased the target from 3 different timelines simultaneously. Victory at Centauri sent shockwaves across the galaxy. For the first time since the invasion began, a major Devourer fleet had been completely destroyed. But more importantly, the mixed species tactics had worked better than anyone had hoped. Ships from different races were learning to fight together in ways that multiplied their effectiveness. The success led to immediate changes in galactic military organization. Admiral Grant was promoted to Supreme Commander of Allied Forces and given authority to reorganize the entire galactic defense structure. Human officers found themselves in command positions throughout the fleet as other races requested human leadership for their most important battles. But the biggest change was in how the galaxy viewed humanity. The species that had been considered weak and insignificant for 3 centuries was now seen as the key to survival. Human colonies that had been isolated and barely defended were suddenly receiving protection from the most powerful alien fleets. Human civilians found themselves being recruited as military advisors by races that had never considered them worth talking to. Dr. Carter made one final discovery that put everything in perspective. Deep space sensors had detected the main Devourer fleet moving toward the galactic core. It was a massive armada unlike anything ever seen, with hundreds of bioships and millions of support craft. The creatures had apparently decided to stop playing games and finish off galactic civilization in one overwhelming assault. The target was obvious. The main fleet was heading directly for the Nexus system, where the Galactic Council maintained its primary facilities. If the Nexus fell, coordination between the major races would collapse, and the galaxy would be defenseless. Every available ship from every member species was being assembled for what would probably be the final battle. General Nelson found herself in command of the largest military force in galactic history, but she also knew that conventional tactics, even modified by human thinking, would not be enough. The upcoming battle would require something unprecedented, a strategy so audacious and illogical that even humans would have trouble believing it could work. As the combined fleets gathered at the Nexus, Nelson began planning the most impossible military operation ever attempted. The survival of galactic civilization would depend on convincing every species to abandon everything they believed about warfare and trust human leadership, in a battle that would determine the fate of trillions of beings across thousands of worlds. The final battle began in the Nexus system on a Tuesday morning, when every sensor in the galaxy detected the largest fleet ever assembled. The Devourer armada stretched across space like a living nightmare, with bioships the size of moons and escort craft that numbered in the millions. At the center of the formation was something that made even hardened military officers stare in horror. The command vessel was not just a ship, but an entire artificial world covered in organic technology and bristling with weapons that could destroy star systems. Admiral Susan Grant stood on the bridge of the UES Constitution and watched the enemy approach. Around her was the combined fleet of every galactic civilization, over 10,000 ships representing dozens of species and centuries of military tradition. But Grant knew that raw numbers would not be enough. The Devourers had adapted to counter every conventional tactic, and they outnumbered the defenders by almost 3-1. The battle plan that General Nelson had developed was so insane that half the alien commanders had refused to believe it was serious. Instead of meeting the Devourers in traditional formation combat, the entire galactic fleet would scatter in all directions and attack using methods that violated every principle of military science. The goal was not to destroy the enemy force, but to create so much chaos that the Devourer command systems could not adapt fast enough to counter the madness. Captain Jake Morrison was given command of the craziest part of the plan. His task force included Sarah Young and her modified fighter, Mike Turner with his weaponized freighter, and 24 other human vessels that had been converted into flying bombs, ramming ships, and mobile garbage dispensers. Their job was to get close enough to the command vessel to allow boarding parties to reach the central intelligence that controlled the entire Devourer fleet. The battle began exactly as planned, which meant it looked like complete chaos from the start. Fourth-act battleships broke formation and charged the enemy fleet from 6 different directions. Zephyrian cruisers started using their matter manipulation abilities to turn asteroids into guided missiles. Keeper vessels activated weapons that created temporal distortions, gravity wells, and energy fields that turned space itself into a weapon. But it was the human ships that created the real confusion. Morrison led his task force in a seemingly suicidal charge directly at the Devourer command ship. Sarah Young flew ahead of the main group, drawing enemy fire while performing maneuvers that should have been impossible. Mike Turner followed behind, his cargo holds filled with industrial waste, obsolete equipment, and deactivated nuclear warheads that he planned to deliver by hand if necessary. The Devourers tried to respond logically to what appeared to be a massive coordinated assault. Their bioships moved to intercept the largest threats while their escort craft engaged the enemy fleet in conventional combat. But every time they established a defensive pattern, the attacking ships would suddenly change tactics and attack from completely unexpected angles. Commander Steve Phillips was leading a mixed squadron of human and keeper vessels in what looked like a standard bombing run on one of the bioships. Just as the Devourer defenses locked onto his formation, Phillips ordered his ships to stop attacking and start broadcasting children's songs from Earth on all frequencies. While the enemy tactical computers tried to understand why they were being attacked with nursery rhymes, the real bombing force approached from the opposite direction. Major Julie Green had finally succeeded in teaching Vorthak warriors how to fight dirty. Her shock troops were using captured Devourer technology against its creators, modified with human engineering and Vorthak brutality. The results were weapons that worked through sheer spite and determination rather than any logical design principles. When Devourer bioships tried to adapt to these hybrid weapons, they discovered that the devices changed their function randomly and could not be countered systematically. The chaos reached its peak when Morrison's task force reached the command vessel. The massive bioship was protected by energy shields, point defense systems, and armor that could withstand direct hits from planet-killing weapons. Morrison ordered his ships to attack using mining lasers, construction tools, and anything else they could find. The defenders tried to adapt but could not understand why humans were essentially trying to repair the enemy ship to death. While the Devourers were distracted by the apparent repair efforts, Sarah Young led a fighter squadron through the ship's defensive grid. Her pilots included beings from every major race, all flying in formation patterns that changed every few seconds and made no tactical sense whatsoever. The enemy point defense systems could not track targets that were deliberately flying in the most inefficient and dangerous manner possible. The breakthrough came when Technical Sergeant Rick Stone led his boarding party onto the command vessel. Stone had been trained in conventional assault tactics, but he threw the manual away as soon as he stepped onto the bioship. Instead of fighting through the corridors like a proper soldier, he used demolition charges to create new paths, turned life support systems into weapons, and generally treated the enemy ship like a construction site that needed to be demolished, rather than a military target that needed to be conquered. Medic Jenny Walsh kept the assault team alive using medical techniques that violated every safety protocol in the Galactic medical database. When Stone was injured by biomechanical defenses, Walsh treated him with human medicines, alien technology, and improvised surgical procedures that worked despite being completely impossible according to medical science. Communications specialist Chris Moore maintained contact with the fleet using radio equipment that he had built from spare parts found on the bioship. His communications array included Devourer technology, human electronics, and components that he had literally torn out of the wall. The system should not have worked, but it provided perfect communication links throughout the battle. The assault team fought their way to the Central Intelligence Chamber where Dr. Helen Carter was waiting with the most important weapon in human history. She had developed a computer virus based on human psychological patterns and illogical thinking processes. The virus was designed to infect the devourer's central mind with the one thing it could not counter or adapt to: pure human irrationality. When Carter uploaded her virus into the command system, the results were immediate and devastating. The devourer intelligence had been designed to process logical tactical data and develop rational responses to military threats. Carter's virus forced it to try understanding human decision-making processes, emotional reasoning, and the kind of tactical thinking that made humans use garbage as weapons and nursery rhymes as psychological warfare. The central intelligence could not comprehend how creatures could be so illogical and still survive. It tried to model human behavior and found contradictions at every level. Humans were simultaneously cowardly and brave, logical and irrational, cooperative and individualistic. The more the devourer mind tried to understand humanity, the more confused it became. Within minutes, the virus had spread throughout the entire devourer fleet. Bioships began malfunctioning as their control systems tried to process impossible human logic patterns. Escort crafts started flying in random directions as their navigation computers attempted to plot courses based on human decision-making algorithms. The massive command vessel began spinning out of control as its central intelligence suffered the equivalent of a nervous breakdown. The Galactic fleet watched in amazement as the most dangerous enemy in the history of the galaxy destroyed itself. Trying to understand why humans thought it was reasonable to attack a battleship with a garbage truck, the Devourer armada collapsed in less than an hour, not because it had been destroyed by superior firepower, but because it had been infected with human thinking and could not recover from the experience. In the aftermath of the victory, the galaxy underwent changes that would have been unimaginable just months before. The Galactic Council was restructured with humanity, holding a permanent seat among the major powers. Human military academies were established on dozens of worlds to teach alien officers how to think creatively and fight unconventionally. Captain Morrison found himself promoted to admiral and placed in command of the new Galactic Defense Force. His task was to make sure that the galaxy would never again be vulnerable to enemies who expected rational behavior from their opponents. The best defense against logical enemies was apparently illogical defenders who could not be predicted or countered. But the most important change was in how the galaxy viewed itself. For millions of years, galactic civilization had been built on the idea that advanced species should think and act in sophisticated logical ways. Humans had proven that sometimes the most advanced response to a problem was to ignore sophistication entirely and do whatever worked, no matter how stupid it looked. The day humans rose, the galaxy learned that strength came in many forms. Sometimes, the greatest power was not in following ancient wisdom or using advanced technology, but in the willingness to try something new, even if it meant looking foolish. Humanity had saved the galaxy, not by becoming like other species, but by remaining stubbornly, chaotically, and brilliantly human.